So today's daf on this Motzaei Shabbat is Masechet Chullin daf Lamed 30, and he didn't quite finish the daf yesterday. I think we're nine or so lines from the bottom of Amar Rava, right? And so the interesting, this is in the middle of a discussion, and some of you might have finished the daf, but I'll go back to where we're up to. The conversation yesterday was about an interesting machloket about. Hello, Miriam. It's great to see you. Hope you're feeling well. We're starting on. You might have finished this, Miriam, but he got up to Chaf Ted Amabet around 11 lines, 10 lines from the bottom, Amarava. And so we'll do that quickly, just in case you've already done it. But the machloket yesterday was about this question about how we view shchita, right? Do you say ein the shchita ela lebesof? Shchita only is effective at the end of shchita, or yeshnu shchita mitchila vad sof? Shchita spans the entire period. We had a lot of questions yesterday about what implications would come. Why does it matter for shchutei chutz, for the paraduma? And we had a whole discussion about this. In the middle of that, or not towards the end of that, says Rava, Ikashali, and the truth is, and we've been talking about the paraduma, says Rava, if there's a problem from this Mishnah about paraduma, hakashali. The problem I have from the Mishnah on paraduma is against the person who holds ein l'shchita ela b'sof, right? If you recall, the Mishnah in paraduma talked about the fact that everyone who does the paraduma becomes tamei because they're part of the action, and that's a gzera they made. The discussion was if you did the shchita, but then it became puzzle in the middle of the shchita, does that make you tamei or not tamei, right? Because you were involved in a paraduma that ultimately was not a paraduma. Says Rava, in that context, the question from the Mishnah to me is the man da'amra in the shchita lebesof. According to the man da'amra yesterday, that shchita is only considered to be the shchita at the end of the act. So I don't understand why the Mishnah had a difference between whether the psul happened in Shechita or the psul happened after Shechita. Why can't the Mishnah have liflog hachshara depara? Why can't you have a distinction in the act of shechting the para, of hechsher of the para, kigon de shechtu betray gavri, right? For example, a case where two people are involved in Shechita. The gavra kama lo mitama, the gavra batra mitama. Let's say you have two people doing Shechita, right? And so if you have two people doing shechita, the first one is starting the shechita, but they are not finished the shechita, and therefore they were not involved in an action of finishing the paraduma, so they don't become tamei. The second one who did the shechita, finished it, should become tamei. So according to that man Amar, why couldn't the mission just talk about two people doing shechita? It says Rav Yosef, there's a reason for that. Because Trey Gavri B'chad Zivcha Kamret, you're talking about two people doing one carbon? Bar Dahi. That's exception. We're going to see in a minute, actually today's daf, that two people can do shchita, but not by karbanot. The Tanina, because we have a braita that explicitly says tizbach. Pasuk says tizbach, which tells you shelo yu shnayim shochatim zevach echad. That by a karban in the Beit Hamikdash, you can't have two people involved in one shchita. And tizbechu means, very interestingly, you can't have one person doing two shchitot at the same time, right? Not obviously you have one person can do shchita twice, but you can't have one person who does shchita on two animals at the same time with a very long knife, right? That is not permitted. And therefore, basically what we're saying is that there's an exception by karbanot, including paraduma, which we treat like a karban, and we're treating that you cannot have two people involved in the shechita. Amar Rav Kahana, and Rav Kahana said tisbechayoktiv. Rav Kahana said, "What do you mean? It's sorry. What do you mean that well, so Rav Kahana is explaining, right? The way, even though tizbechu, read the pasuk, tizbechuhu is singular, it's the reading, the way it's read, the way it's written, sorry, is tizbachehu, which is plural. So that's how we learn from this pasuk. So that's why Rava said there's no question from this Mishnah about whether two people could do shchita and the first person would be puzzle and the second one wouldn't, because such a concept does not exist by a carbon. Amrle Abayna, Abayis said back to this case of Rav Yosef, Lavitmarla, didn't we say about this halacha? Amar B'chan, Amar Yochanan, Zu Divrei Rabbi Elazar Rabbi Shimon Stimta'a. This is the stam opinion of Rabbi Elazar Rabbi Shimon. Aval Chachamim Omrim, the Chachamim said, Shnaim Shochatim Zevach Echad. This braita that says that two people cannot do shchita on one karban is Rabbi Elazar Rabbi Shimon. But the Chachamim disagree, and they hold that you can have two people doing shechita. One does the first half, one does the second half. So now, if that's true, says the Gemara, so therefore, it's not a great explanation. Ask the Gemara, Ula Rebbe Lezer, Rebbe Shimon. We are at the top, I believe. Sorry, I always have trouble with the Gemara here. Um, Ask the Gemara at the top, second line of Daf Lamed of Aleph. Ula Rabbi Elazar, Rabbi Shimon, Nami Liflog. Now, even Rabbi Elazar, Rabbi Shimon, who says you can't have two people doing shechita together, but why can't you say it's a case where Nami Liflog? Why don't you have a distinction in the paraduma in the shachet chagavra b'shnei sudarim? Why can't you have a case where one person shechted an animal basically with two sudarim, meaning two sudarim that he's wearing, essentially, bigadim that you're wearing. Remember that the bigadim become tamei when the person doing the shechita becomes tamei. But he has two kippot, let's say. Sudar literally means a scarf, right? The sudar kama lo metame, right? Let's say you start doing shechita and you're wearing, I don't know, a sweater. And in the middle of the shechita, your sweater gets bloody. You take off the sweater, you put on a new one, right? So in that case, when you finish the shechita, the sweater you're wearing will become tamei, but the first one will not. The sudar kamak lo mitama v'sudar batra mitame. In this case, if it was true that ein l'shchita el lebesof, then the beginning of the shechita is not the act of shechita, and the first clothing you're wearing are not tamei, only the last clothing. Ella says, Gemara, you're right. We can't really prove anything from this para. Psula de para kamari, behachshera lo kamari. In the Mishnah, we're only talking about doing a paraduma in a way that the para becomes pasul. We're not talking about doing it in a way where the para is okay, meaning we're not looking for cases where it's done properly. We're looking for cases where it's done improperly, and therefore you can't prove anything from the Mishnah of paraduma. So that is the answer to that. And asked Rav Avin, Masa Ravidi Bar Avin now, is that really true? Says Ravidi Bar Avin. Now we're talking about a whole different case here, right? Remember, we had a discussion in a Mishnah. This is a quote from a Mishnah that if you take a carbon Pesach, right? Remember, carbon Pesach is essentially a shlamim. On Erev Pesach, it's done as a carbon Pesach and it has its own halachot. You can only eat it for one night. You have to do certain things for it. But if you take a carbon Pesach and you shecht it as a shlamim, it's kosher as a shlamim. Says the Mishnah in Psachim, b'moed, if you shecht the carbon Pesach during Chag, meaning its time, which is not during Pesach, but on Friday, on the Erev Pesach afternoon, if you do it lishmo, right, if you do it for the sake of carbon Pesach, then you're pater. Then you're pater. The discussion that we're talking about in Psachim is that basically you have chametz in your possession while you shech the carbon Pesach. So remember, the pasuk says, "Lo tishchot al chametz dam zivchi," right? Don't shech the carbon Pesach if you have chametz in your house. Okay, if you shechted the carbon Pesach but not l'shem carbon Pesach, then you are pater, right? So now, let's say, and I said Moed was earlier, I meant Moed was during the holiday. Let's say you take your carbon Pesach and you shecht it during Pesach, right? Bin Moed l'shmo, if you shecht it for carbon Pesach, then you're patur. And the reason you're patur is because you're basically shechting a carbon Pesach during Chag Pesach when it's not supposed to be done. And therefore, basically, you didn't do a carbon, right? And so therefore you're patur because you're patur from having chametz in your possession because you didn't do a carbon. But if you do it shelo lishmo, if you do the carbon Pesach on Pesach, not for the sake of a Pesach, then it becomes a shlamim. And then you're chayev. You're chayev because you shechted your shlamim with chametz in your possession. Now we asked about this Mishnah. This is all Ravidi Bar Avin's question. Taima de shelo lishma. The implication of the first part of the Mishnah is that the only reason that you're patur, that you're chayav, is because you shechted the carbon Pesach shelo lishmo. You said, I am not doing this for a Pesach. Hastama patur. But if you had done it stam, you would be patur, right? Ask the Gemara, my patur, why if you did a carbon Pesach stam during, let's say, third day of Pesach, you shechted your carbon Pesach and didn't say anything. Why is you patur? Why don't we say that Pesach b'shar yemot hashlama shlamimu? That Pesach in the rest of the year is a shlamim. So even though you said nothing when you did it, because it's the third day of Pesach and you missed your chance to bring carbon Pesach with this animal, the animal automatically becomes a shlamim and therefore you'd be chayev. Shemamino, what you see from this is that Pesach b'shar yemot hashana b'y akira. That in order to change a carbon Pesach into a shlamim, you have to say something. You have to say, I no longer am treating this like a carbon Pesach. Okay, this is all part of the question. We're not the question yet. So that is what we learn from the Mishnah. And Amar Rabbi Chia Bar Gamda, now Rabbi Chia Bar Gamda said that Nizrika mipi chabura, right? It was thrown out in the chabura, meaning someone said it. We don't have a name exactly of who said it, but somebody gave an explanation for Amru, and they said, Hacha b'mayaskinan. What is the actual case in Psachim where you had to say that I am doing this as a shlamim in order for it to be a shlamim? It's not because Stam needs, not because you have to be remove the name of the Korban Pesach. It's Gegon Shayu Ba'alim Tamei Metim. It's talking about a case where the owners actually were Tamei on Pesach Rishon or Pesach, right? And therefore, Nidachim the Pesach Sheni. They, because they were Tamei, are now supposed to do Pesach Sheni. So now, because they have a responsibility to do Pesach Sheni, their carbon, which they didn't do on Pesach Rishon, is still a Pesach, right? Because they're going to bring it on Pesach Sheni. So stama l'shmoka. Here, if you didn't say explicitly, I want to do it for a shlamim, we would assume you want to do it for carbon pesach because it's still a carbon pesach, right? The high hu de akira, in that case, where the owners are tame, and therefore they can bring the same animal for pesach sheni. If you want to change it to a shlamim, you have to say, I'm changing it to a shlamim. Ha'acher lo akira. But another animal does not need akira. Okay, so that was the whole discussion in carbon in Pesach.
But what about the case where your Korban Pesach is 11 and a half months old on
Right. That's
Pesach
a good question.
Rishon?
So 100%. So then obviously would not apply in that. Good point.
Mm.
So I was leaving that behind, but it's true. It still means the animal is ra'oi for Pesach Sheni because it's not too old, as Charlie just pointed out. If it's a year old, it's no longer kosher. So correct. It would not, then it would probably lose its status. But our
Hmm.
point is that you don't lose the status if it's suitable to be done on Pesach Sheni because you still treat it like a carbon Pesach. Now,
Gotcha.
that's the question. Says Gemara, what's relevant from this? This relates to our question of whether shechita goes from the beginning to end or only at the end. Because if you say that shechita goes from the beginning of your action to the end of your action, so now imagine the scenario here. It's the third day of Pesach, and you start shechting your carbon Pesach. You don't say what you're doing it for, right? But says the Gemara, the second you start shechting your carbon Pesach, you obviously can no longer bring it on Pesach Sheni because it's dead, right? Or it's going to be dead. So if Solei Mitchilat Shchita, you parceled it from being brought on Pesach Sheni from the beginning of the Shchita, right? So why don't you say that basically at this point it's no longer, well, it's, so sorry. So from the beginning, the whole thing became puzzle. If you're of the opinion that shechita only happens at the end of the action, so then when you started doing the shechita, it's not called shechita yet. It's just a knife at the animal's neck. But kivan de shachat beporta itchile mi pesach. When you shechted it a little bit, you haven't finished the shechita yet, so it's not called shechita. But clearly, you're not going to be able to bring it on Pesach Sheni, right? So idach ki kashachet shlamim kashachet. So now, even without saying, I want this to change from a Pesach to a shlamim, the fact is it can no longer be a Pesach because once you started the shechita, you can't bring it on Pesach Sheni. And so when you finish the shechita, you're obviously doing it for a shlamim, and therefore you shouldn't need to say, I'm doing it for a shlamim. There's no alternative, right? So again, if you understand shechita goes as one full act, then it's all one act. But if shechita is only at the end, then the beginning of it should passel from Pesach Sheni, and therefore it should be assumed to be a shlamim. Says Abaya, that's a really nice point. But you want to know something? All you can show when you start shechting it is nihide itchile mi Pesach. You can't use this animal for Pesach Sheni anymore. But you know what you could do? You could potentially sell this animal and use the money for Pesach Sheni. Means May Pesach mi idri? Did you push it out from being May Pesach? I mean, you could shech the animal. You can use it as a carbon. You can sell the animal to shlamim, right? You can sell whatever you get from it, and you could use it for Pesach Sheni. So you haven't changed the status of the animal from Pesach Sheni because the owners were Tameh and they have to do Pesach Sheni. The Chitem, now you're going to say, what do you mean you can use the money? You can't use money from Kachim by Hamadava Haracha. In order to evaluate, in order to redeem an animal from Kachim, you can't just say this animal's worth $50. You have to remember, we want to make sure Hektish never gets cheated. So you always have to stand up an animal, get it evaluated in front of the Kohen, or the Kohen does it, before you can redeem something of Hektish. And obviously, if you start shechting your animal, you can't stand it up and get it redeemed. Hatnan, we learned, right? Or sorry, and we learned, this is the answer. Hatznan says the Gemara, because we learned shachat ba shnayim or rov shnayim va'adayin hi mifarcheset harei kechai l'chol devaraha, right? When the Mishnah is going to say later, when you shech an animal, either both simanim or most of both simanim, but it's still moving around like animals do for some, like humans do, but animals do for some time after they are slaughtered. Harehi kichaya l'chol devaraha. It's considered to be like a living animal for all matters, and therefore, as long as the animal is still flailing, you can actually redeem it. And so what you could do in theory is take this carbon pesach, shecht it. Obviously, it can't be used for Pesach Sheni because it's dead, but you can redeem it, take that money and use the money for Pesach Sheni. And therefore, you have to, basically going back to the Mishnah, you have to take off the status and say, I no longer want this to be a carbon pesach. I want it to be a carbon shlamim, but this does not prove anything to us about whether shechita goes from beginning till end or shechita is only at the end. And so
How
that
would
is,
you stand it up before the Kohen?
you don't have to stand it up, but the point is that you don't have to actually stand it up, but as long as it's moving, it's considered like a live animal. So the Kohen would have to be standing there, of course, but you're in the Beit HaMikdash, the Kohen's there. So Hamadan Arachaz is just a sort of phrase. It doesn't literally mean standing, it means assessed in front of the Kohen.
But we often interpret it as standing before the Kohen, like the
We mean you have to bring it in front of the Kohen, obviously.
Mitzora and the Soto. We have to stand.
Sorry, I didn't hear the end of you, James.
Oh, the Mitzora and the Sota. I think we have to like physically stand up before the Kohen, right?
Right. No, but those, I mean, again, those are different. That's because it says bring them in front of the Kohen. I mean, we had this week's Parsha. Right? So there's different points. The reason you have to bring in front of the Kohen is not for the same reason as the Mitzvah and the Sota, which has to be done in front of the Kohen. It does, but just because we want the hektish to get the right value, right? So we rely on the Kohanim to be the valuators for these things. So Hamadan or Acha here does not literally mean you have to stand it up. It means it has to be present in front of the Kohen and alive, right? Not dead, because when something is dead, it's harder to evaluate. So we are calling it still alive as long as it's still moving.
Seems like it'd actually be easier to evaluate if it was not moving.
That could be. It's true. Um, okay, let us continue. Back, we're going to move back. I'm trying to find our place. We are Rav Yehuda Marav, which is around a little more than halfway down on Daf Lamed Amud Aleph, and we're about to get back to Chullin. So for those who didn't like the not Chullin, here we're back to Chullin. This says Rav Yehuda Marav, a very seminal halacha of shechita, which is hashochet b'shnayim u'shlosha mikomot shechitato kshira. Remember that in order to shech the animal, you have to cut rov of the siman. Says Rav, it doesn't have to be in one place. It could be in two or three places on the neck of the animal, right? So meaning you cut 20% of the esophagus, let's just say, in one spot, and then go down a few inches and cut another 20%, and down a few inches, cut another 20%. Shechita kshera. That's considered to be a kosher shechita. Now, the pshat I just gave you is only one pshat in what this means. There are many, many other pshatim. Not all of them agree with what I just told you, but that's one explanation. Says that was what Rav Yehuda Marav said. Remember, Rav Yehuda was a student of Rav, right? And then he was a student of Shmuel after Rav died. Ki Amrita kamei de Shmuel. And Rav Yehuda quoted this in front of Shmuel and said, "This is what Rav told me." Amar Shmuel said to me, "No, it's not true. Be'inan shchita mifora'at. You need a shechita that opens up the neck, the leka. And this doesn't open it up, right? Because as I just described it, the fact is you cut a little bit here and a little bit there and a little bit there. It doesn't stretch the neck and open it up. We want you to cut it so that it's basically all the way, not necessarily all the way through, but rove of the siman so that you can actually open up the windpipe or the esophagus or the windpipe. So this is not a kosher shechita because it doesn't open up the neck or open up the esophagus or the trachea. So that was what Rav Shmuel said. V'amar v'afar b'Shimon ben Lakish savar b'inin shchita meforat, and also Rish Lakish in Israel said that you need a shchita that's wide open. V'amar b'Shimon ben Lakish b'nayin shchita shim meforat. How do you know from a pasuk that shchita has to basically cut through the majority of the siman so that it then splays open? Shenamar, because it says in a pasuk in Yirmiyahu, chetz shachut l'shonam, an arrow slaughters their tongues. Mirma diber, because he spoke lashon hara or lies. But just like an arrow, think about an arrow, right? When you cut through something with an arrow clearly enters, and you could see, and we're going to see this in Amabet as well, that there has to be clear that this is cut and this is separated, so to shchita has to be the same way. So if you cut small holes throughout the esophagus or the trachea of the animal so that you have a rove of one ring, that's not enough. It's not obvious like when an arrow is shot into something. So that's the halacha, the machloket of Rav Yehuda, Amarav, and Shmuel. Ask the Gemara, let's try to prove proof from the next Mishnah. Mativ Rabbi Elazar, the Mishnah is going to say in a minute, Shnayim ochazim b'sakim v'shochatim. If you have two people holding onto a knife and shechting, now we think this means, right, that two people are holding their own knives. So two people are shechting the animal at one time. Afila echad milamala v'echad milamata. One is up on the trachea, one is lower down on the trachea. Shchita tokshira. It's a kosher shchita. Amai, why is it kosher? If one is higher and one is lower, you didn't make a full cut in any one spot. Haleka shchita miforat. You don't have an open shchita, an exposed neck. Amalei Rabbi Yirmiyah says, Rabbi Yirmiyah, you misunderstood the Mishnah completely. The Mishnah is not referring to two people holding a knife each, two knives. Mishnatenu b'sakin echadu shnei b'nei adam. The Mishnah says two people shechting means two people are holding one knife, right? Echad lemala v'echad lemata, right, means that basically one is higher up on the knife and one is lower down on the knife, not that one is cutting the animal higher and one is cutting the animal lower. So you didn't understand the Mishnah. Amalei Rabba said, Rabba, really? Ihachi, if that's what the Mishnah means, Hainu ditani alei. This is what the Braita explains about the Mishnah when it says, Ein choshashim shema yitrafu zeh al zeh. We're not worried that they're going to cause a treifa one for the other. Meaning we're not worried that by two people doing shchita is going to cause a treifa. Now I don't get right? If it's really two people with two knives, so each one is doing their own act of shchita, I understand why you might have thought it would be a treifa. Because ma'aditema, you might have thought leichash dilma samchei adadi, right? Each one is relying on the other one, meaning they're saying, I'm going to make a small cut because my friend 2 feet above me or 3 inches above me is making a big cut. And so neither one of them is going to make a proper cut. Hi lo ati lemevad ruba. Hi lo ati lemevad ruba. This one doesn't cut enough, and this one doesn't cut enough. So you might have thought that that would be a problem. And therefore the Mishnah comes to say, don't worry about two people doing shchita, it's still kosher, right? So that makes sense if we're talking about two people holding two knives. If you're talking about two people holding one knife, what do you mean you're not worried they're going to cause a treifa? The problem with two people holding one knife that you have to worry about is that they're not going to go back and forth. They're just going to put pressure down on the neck of the animal, and that's a psul that we call drisa, right? Pushing down. So then it should have said that. It should have said Shema Yidrisu Zal Zemi Boile. The concern with two people holding one knife is that, like two people holding a saw, right? You can go back and forth, or you can just push down. And if you push down, that's called drisa, and it's a psul. Amalei Rabbi Oven, sorry, I said Rabbi Oven, you're right. That's what the Mishnah means. When the Braita says, sorry, Ein chol sheshim yitrafu, change the language. It means Ein chol sheshim, turn the page, Shema yidrasu zeh al zeh. That's really what it means. That although it's two people, and you might have thought that they're not going to do horizontal movements, they're going to do vertical movements, which is called drisa, you don't have to worry about that. And so therefore, that's exactly what we meant when we said it. So stop driving me crazy. Okay, so that's the answer to that question, even though it's not the easiest answer. Now, Mativ Reb Oven asked another question from another Braita, right? Because the Braita says the following: Shachat et aveshet lemata. If you shech the veshet, remember the veshet is I always get them wrong. The veshet is what we call the esophagus. Nava is another word for it. I forgot what it was. Some other word. So you shech the veshet, the gullet, I think was your word, right? Lemata, so lower down on the neck. Etakana, which is the windpipe, the trachea, lemala, further up on the neck. Oh, etaveshet lemala etakana lemata, or you cut one higher up and one lower down, meaning you don't cut them in the same place. Shchita tok shira, the shchita is kosher. It says, but why? Amai haleka shchita miforat. You don't have shchita miforat because again, if you cut one siman further up and one siman further down, you can't basically open up the neck because in any one spot it's not totally exposed. Says the Gemara, who motifla, he asked the question, Rav Avin, and he thought of his own answer to the question. That in fact, the case where it's kosher, when we say above and below, is where shchita hasuya kulmus. It's something where you did the shchita like a kulmus, like a kulmus usually means like a quill, basically, right? So that basically what you did in this case was that you cut the whole thing diagonally, right? So that you cut through the neck at an angle, and a quill, I guess, is written is like an angle. You did it on an angle from top to bottom, or from top further up in the neck to lower down in the neck, so that at the higher point you cut through the trachea, and the lower point you cut through the esophagus, or vice versa. That's kosher, but basically it's one big cut. And because it's one big cut, you can actually open up the neck and it would be shchita meforat. It's not talking about a case where you cut at least trachea higher and then went down a foot and cut the esophagus, because that, in fact, would not be shchita meforat. Now, in fact, there was a case, a hutura. There was a certain cow, right? Sure. The ishchat b'shnayim u'shlosha mekomot. It was shechted the way that Rav Yehuda Marav said was a problem in two or three places. I'm sorry, Rav Yehuda Marav said it's okay. Shmuel said it's a problem. So this case happened. All Rabbi Yitzchak bar Shmuel bar Marta, Rabbi Yitzchak bar Shmuel bar Marta heard about this case, and he went to the store and shakal mishifurei shifrei. He bought the fanciest steaks from this cow. He bought the highest of the high quality. He thought this was kosher, and he said, "Great, I'm going to go get myself a good rib steak." Amalei Reb Zera said Rabbi Zera clearly, right? He was of the opinion, Limadatanu, sorry, this was this is his explanation, that basically the reason he thought it was kosher is because Limadatanu Rabbeinu Mishnatenu B'Shnei Sakinim B'Shnei B'nei Adam. He must have held that when the Mishnah says two people can do shchita, it means two people with two knives. And so if you have two people with two knives, it means one cut higher up, one cuts lower down, and basically you do not need shchita meforat. According to this psak of Shmuel bar Yitzchak bar Mirta, you don't need shchita meforat. You just need to cut through the rove of the siman. And so if you do some of it of a higher and some of it lower, and you can't open up the neck and expose it, that's not a problem. So it turns out it's a machloket Rav and Shmuel, of course, and this Amora of Yitzchak bar Shmuel paskin like Rav in this case. Amar Rav Yehuda Marav. Now says Rav Yehuda Marav one more halacha, I think, than the Mishnah, not quite, almost. Says Rav Yehuda Marav another interesting halacha, which is quite complicated. What he means by this is he chlidet sakin ben siman simanu pasko. Remember that we have a one of the psulim of shchita is called chalada, and we're going to explain. We're going to go through it in more mishnayot. But chalada literally means you dig the knife in, right? Chalad we translate from chulda, it's hidden. So basically, instead of cutting from the outside, you put the knife under the siman and then cut. So says Rav Yehuda Marav, let's say you basically were machlid the sakin between one siman and the other siman, right? And what we think that means, again, we're going to see in a second, that you stuck the knife into the neck of the animal between the trachea and the esophagus, and then you cut the simanim from inside. Says Rav Yehuda Marav, that's psula. But if you took the knife and you put it under the skin, so instead of cutting from the outside, you put the knife under the skin so it's hidden, and then you cut through the simanim, that's kshira. That's not a problem. Meaning that the chalada has to be between the simanim, not under the skin. Now, my kamashma says, Gemara, why is Rav Yehuda Marav telling me that? That's not a chiddush. Tanina, the Mishnah is going to say in a couple of days, we're going to have this in Lamed Bet. O shechlida tesakin tachadasheni upasko. Right? That if you stick the knife under the second siman and you then cut it, Rabbi Yeshavev Omer Nevela, Rabbi Kiva Omer Treifa, that's the case of chalada. So the Mishnah very clearly says that chalada means you stick the knife between the two simanim, not under the skin. So what's Rav Yehuda Marav adding? Answers the Gemara, Imatnitan, if it was from the Mishnah alone, Havamina, I would have thought, Hani mili milamata lilamala. The reason in the Mishnah that it's a psul of chalada is because you stuck the knife between the two simanim, and then you cut upwards, right? Because your knife, instead of going downwards, you're in between the simanim. So you cut milamata milamala. You cut up from below, from lower to higher. And the reason it's puzzle is the lo ka'avin derech shchita. That's not the normal way people cut. Normally, when people shecht an animal, they cut from top to bottom, and you go down. Aval, maybe if you stuck your knife between the two simanim and you cut milamala lemata, you cut the bottom siman from up to down, and then maybe you took your knife out and cut the other siman. That would be the gavik derech shchita, because you did it in a way that people generally do shchita of going downwards, ema shaper dummy. Maybe that would be fine. Kamashma, what Rav told us is that that's not fine. Is that the psul of chalada is anytime you stick the knife between the two simanim and cut from the inside, that's a psul shchita. Shchita has to start from the outside, though it could start from under the skin. Tachata arik shera. Tachat Ar, according to Rabbi Yehuda Marav, is kosher. But the truth is that although Rabbi Yehuda said that in the name of Rav, in Bei Rav, in the house of Rav, which generally means, the Talmidim in the school after Rav died, Amri, they said, we're not so sure you're right. Tachat Ar, Eni Yodea. We're not really sure what the halacha would be if you stuck the knife under the skin and then cut through the simanim. Maybe that would also be a problem of chalada. It says the Gemara, wait 1 second. Ibaylo. Lebei Rav, when the house of Rav said, the Amri, Tachatar Eni Yodea, right? Does that mean because you can't see the knife? And so if you can't see the knife, because remember, it's concealed under the skin, so you don't actually see it, is that a problem in seeing the knife when you do the shchita? And what about Tachat Matleit Mao, right? What if the knife was covered by a towel? So it was on the neck of the animal. It wasn't under the skin, but it was concealed. Or what if tachat semer musubach? What if you have an animal, you have a sheep, right? That has a lot of wool, and it's got this really, we've seen the sheep at the fair, right? They've got layers and layers of wool on top of their neck. So by the time the knife cuts through that wool or goes through the wool, you can't even see the knife anymore. Is that a problem of chalada? Do you have to shave the neck before you do shchita? Teiko, and we actually don't resolve that question. So again, according to Rav Yehuda Marav, sticking the knife under the skin and then you can't see the knife and doing shchita is not a problem. So obviously sticking the knife under the wool of the animal is not a problem, right? But according to the Beirav, who said we're not really sure. If the knife disappears, maybe it's a problem of chalada. What if the knife disappears through a cloth or through the wool of the animal, and we leave it open? We don't know what the halacha would be in that case. One last line before the Mishnah. Hopefully it's all clear. I know this is complicated stuff. But the last question, or one line before the Mishnah on Daf Lamed Amid Bet, by Rav Papa. Asked Rav Papa one other question. What if you are hichlid b'miut simanim? There's a huge uncertainty about what in the world this means. Rashi, you could see there's a long Rashi. He's got a very interesting explanation of this, but he doesn't like it. But basically, Rav Papa says if you do chalada, remember chalada means where you can't see the knife when you're going in, so you stick the knife into the neck of the animal and then do your cut. Mahu is if you do it with miut simanim. So Rashi's one explanation of Rashi is that basically you cut through rova the siman, okay, and then you took the knife out and you said, oh wait, I didn't get the whole thing, and you stick the knife in to cut the last part. So even though you really don't need to cut that part, right? It's not necessary because you did rova the siman already. But when you cut the last part, you did chalada. Says Rav Papa, I don't know what the halacha is there, teku. And he leaves it open. And Rashi is very bothered because we've had many cases before which imply that once you do Rov Siman, it doesn't really matter what you do after that. But Rashi understands that this is Rav Papa's question. You did most of the shechita kosher, but then mi'ut simanim, the last part of it, you did through chalada. Is that going to ruin the whole thing or not ruin the whole thing? And Rav Papa does not resolve that question, so we don't know. Wow, that was fast. Okay, hopefully everyone's still with me, right? Says the Mishnah, halfway down, almost done, Daf Lamed Amud Bet, the case that we mentioned earlier. Hashochet shnei rashim ke'achad, if a person cuts off two heads of an animal at one time, right? You line up two animals, you got a nice knife, and you cut through shchita of both animals at once, shchita tok shera. That's not a problem. So kosher shchita. Now remember, we said earlier today, if it was kudshim, it would be a problem, but this is not kudshim, obviously. So regular animals, you can line them up and shech them. Now, let's say you have shnaim ochazim b'sakim. You have two people holding a knife, b'shochatin, and they do shchita. Remember, we said earlier today, there's a machloket. Does this mean two people are holding one knife, or are two people holding two knives and doing shchita at the same neck? Says the Mishnah, even if either one is above on the knife and one is lower on the knife, or one is above on the neck of the animal, or one is lower on the neck of the animal, it's kosher. Hitiz et arosh bevatachat. If you cut off the head in one fell motion, right? You just chop it off, basically. That's psula because that's drisa, right? That's where you pushed basically against the neck. You didn't cut. You just hatcheted it off. Now, let's say you're doing shchita properly, but basically your knife is so sharp that hitizat arosh bevatachat. You essentially went straight on the neck, and it came off. The head came off, or was decapitated, meaning the whole head came off in one motion of your knife. So you didn't go and come back or go back and forth many times. So then, im yesh b'sakin malot savar kshera. if the knife is big enough, we're going to see this more in the Gemara, what that means big enough, but if the knife is as big as the neck, then it's kosher. And what we're going to see is that means is that the knife is big as the neck outside of the knife that you cut. So let's say the neck of the animal is 6 inches long. Your knife has to be that 6 inches plus an additional space that would be the neck of the animal, another 6 inches, let's say. So we'll see in the Gemara all these shiurim. But you have to have a big enough knife because otherwise we worry that if the knife is the same size as the neck, that you basically just chopped off the neck, and that's a psul of drisa. Now let's say hayashochet, let's say you're shechting, right? And you're shechting two animals. But again, your knife is so sharp, or you're so good at shechita, that it is shnei rashim bevat achat. You cut off the entire head of both animals in one motion. So again, the same principle lives. Im yesh b'sakin melot savar achad kshera. If the sakin is big enough for the neck, it's kosher. And again, we'll see in the Gemara that it has to be big enough for both necks, and we'll see why the language of echad shows up. Now, when is that true? That is bisman sheholich v'lo hevi. That's if you only do it in one act. So you go, but you never come back, right? The heads are disconnected before you come back. Oh hevi v'lo holich, or you come towards you and then don't ever go back the other way. Aval im holich v'hevi. But if you go back and forth, then afilu koshu, even a tiny bit of motion in the second direction, afilu be'izmo, and even if you're using something called an izmo, which we'll see is a very, very sharp knife, kshera, that's not a problem because as long as there's some more than one action, we're not worried that you're just chopping off the head, right? There's remember there has to be horizontal movement, not just vertical movement when you cut it off. And so as long as you go there and back or back and there, then it's kosher. Now, says Gemara, let's do this one step at a time. How do you even know that there's a problem with chopping off the head of an animal? Not immediately, meaning how do you know that drisa is a problem? Amar Shmuel da Amar Kah, because the pasuk that we quoted earlier today, Chetz shachut l'shonam mirmad diber, that the the language here of shchita, of course, we're talking here about speaking bad words, but we use the word chetz, an arrow, that shechs the tongue. So you see that shchita is similar to the action of an arrow, and an arrow, of course, never works by brute force, right? Because an arrow has to be pulled back, gets potential energy, and is then released. So just like an arrow has to go across, basically, the knife also has to go across. And if the knife just comes down and cuts the thing off, it's not considered to be a proper shchita. Tani de Rabbi Shmuel. Rabbi Shmuel says, I have a different proof for this. It says the word vishachat, right? And ein vishachat ela umashach. Shachat literally means to me that you have to draw. Mashach means you do mashicha, right? You carry it across. V'cheinu omer, and similarly it says zahav shachut. We talk about gold that's being drawn gold in Shlomo's in Melachim. So the word, in order to be called shchita, it has to be an action of pulling something across. If it just chops it off, we wouldn't use the word shchita. So that's the proof, says Rabbi Shmuel. The Omer, and you know what? There's a second pasuk that we just quoted. That shchita is like an arrow. It says more, why the Omer? Why Tan Rabbi Shmuel bring a second pasuk? The chitema, because you might say, no. The reason the pasuk says the word zahav shachut is not to tell you that you draw gold. It means maybe shenitveh kechutu. It means that maybe shachut means that your gold is sewn, is woven, spun like a chut. So instead of using the word shachut as meaning shchita, maybe the pasuk shachut means shachut, that it's like a thread, right? A thread of string. Tashma, therefore, chetz shachut shanam, therefore we bring the second pasuk. So that's why we have to have a second pasuk to explain the implication of shchita as being where you cut something through a horizontal motion, meaning through a going back and forth or going in that direction, and not just going down in a vertical motion, which would be called drisa. I think we should stop here because it's late. Is everyone okay with that? We're going to stop here. We're near the bottom. How many lines in the bottom? 3 lines in the bottom. Rava, Havibadik, and God willing, we'll pick it up from there in just a few hours at 7:45 a.m. or if you're in Chicago, 6:45 a.m. So thank you. Hope to see some of you tomorrow morning. I know Charlie's traveling. I know Nava will be here, and I'm not worried. But Shavua Tov, everyone.
Shavua Tov.
See you soon.